We are facing several enormous threats that could keep our human civilization from surviving and thriving. These are global problems that no one country alone can solve. And we're quite vulnerable right now because our world does not have the systems in place to coordinate and manage these risks. The best vehicle we have is the United Nations system, but it's not up to the task to help us through this crisis. So we need to fix it and make it stronger. With us today to talk about how we can do that is Mark Leon Goldberg, podcaster, writer, international affairs expert. He has tons of great insights to share with us in a really great conversation. Let's dig in. This is the joy of saving the human race, where we try to get the world to cooperate. It's so the human race can avoid some urgent global problems that could mean the end of civilization and cause lots of suffering around the world. But also, we just want to have a good world that we enjoy and we can feel proud of. We are not just citizens of our own countries, we are citizens of the human race. Let's learn to manage ourselves responsibly. Let's help the human race act like it wants to last for a while. I think humans are awesome and the human race is worth saving. There is no time to waste, so let's do this. Hi friends, welcome to the joy of saving the human race. I'm Shelby Murtis. Thanks for joining me today. So before we dive in, I just want to remind you that this show is available in several places, on YouTube, on Spotify, on multiple podcast players, and I encourage you to subscribe in one or more places. That way you can be updated when new shows come out and we can stay in touch that way. And of course hit the like and subscribe and all that good stuff, which helps. So today we are going to talk with Mark Leon Goldberg. He is really smart in the area of international affairs, United Nations, and all that good stuff. He is the editor of the UN Dispatch, which is a United Nations and Global Affairs blog. He also is co-founder of the news clip service Dawn's Digest, which is Development and Aid World News Service. And he is also the host of an outstanding podcast called Global Dispatches Podcast. And that's where I've gotten to know Mark over a few years now of listening to so many episodes of his show. It's a really great way to keep up on world affairs and what's going on. And, you know, if I manage ever to say anything smart on international affairs, I probably heard it from Mark. So I'm grateful for all that I've learned from him and his show. So, Mark, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So let me just kind of frame this conversation about what I'd like to learn from you about and just sort of toss some ideas around. So over, some years now, I've become increasingly concerned with some really big threats to humanity, where our future could be pretty bleak if we don't solve things like climate change, the destruction of nature, pandemics, nuclear weapons, which could blow us all up, but yet people don't talk about it enough. And some related issues like, intense migration of people that could happen from climate change or, poverty and inequality in the world. There's some really, really serious stuff that we face that no one country alone can solve. And so I'm looking at the United Nations system as pretty critical to the future success of humanity. Do you share this kind of concern, or am I exaggerating or being overly dramatic? It feels incredibly important to me in that way, but I don't know. How do you feel on this front, I guess, and what makes the United Nations important to you, and why do you work so much on it?
So, I firmly believe there are a certain set of global problems from climate change to nuclear proliferation to, we used to talk about terrorism to global terrorism. to gender equality and inequality around the world, to poverty and inequality in general. These are a set of global problems that really require global solutions. We used to call them problems without passports. These are the kinds of issues that require global cooperation to solve, and the United Nations can be a useful platform around which organizations, countries, people can work towards common solutions to these global problems.
Yeah, yeah. So I want much of our conversation to talk about maybe how we can beef up the United Nations system and improve it and make it more capable of dealing with these threats. But we should first maybe focus on the positive. Like what's good about it? What has it achieved so far that's been useful that we can build upon?
So, the most basic fundamental utility of the United Nations since 1945 has been that there has not been a third world war. In the generation preceding the founding of the United Nations, there were two world wars. In fact, in the preamble to the UN Charter, they talk about, you know, the preceding generations having, been engulfed by these two world wars, and the goal of the United Nations was to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. There, of course, have been lots of wars. There's been lots of internal conflict. There's been lots of inter wars between countries, but there has not been this major cataclysmic war that there was twice prior to the founding of the UN. So, on that fundamental premise, the UN has succeeded. Um, there are, it has obviously fallen short of saving the world from war. Wars happen all the time today. But one thing I think that's often overlooked in how the general public perceives the United Nations is that there are really like two UNs. When I talk to people about the UN, there's the UN that talks and there's the UN that acts. The UN that talks is the UN that often falls short of coming together around, for example, a way to stop the Syria crisis, or unity at the Security Council to, prevent a famine from befalling Ethiopia, which looks like it's going to happen pretty soon. So there are those kind of failures of the UN that talks. There are also some successes of the UN that talks, but those are it's typically the failures that get the most attention, and rightfully so. But then there's the UN that acts. This is the UN that is providing humanitarian assistance around the world, that's providing shelter and safe haven for millions of refugees, that is coordinating a global rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine, that's supporting countries in Africa that don't have the health capacity on their own to beef up their health systems to tackle preventable childhood illnesses, and has made polio virtually extinct from around the world. So there's sort of the UN in the world, and then there's the UN that talks. And so it's, I think, important when we're talking about success or failures of the UN to disaggregate those two.
Do you think the positive sides are poorly understood in the world, like by policymakers or by regular people?
Yeah, I think in general, the United Nations is like an underappreciated, at least here in the United States, is an underappreciated tool of U.S. foreign policy and also of global security. Um, you know, Policymakers here in the United States often, I think, don't in particular appreciate the role of UN peacekeepers around the world. There's like about 100,000 peacekeepers in about 12 missions around the world right now. And by and large, these peacekeepers are preventing simmering conflicts from turning into like hot conflicts that could have really profound international implications. So you have, even peacekeeping missions that have been around forever, like in Cyprus. Cyprus used to be this place where Turkey and Greece would fight over. And now there has been a peacekeeping there for decades and decades, but there's no hot conflict there as well. People aren't dying in Cyprus because in part of this peacekeeping mission. Or you can look at many other peacekeepings. Not all of them are sort of made the same, but in many situations around the world, peacekeepers have been able to contribute to a reduction of violence. A good example of this is Liberia, I think. There is no UN peacekeeping mission in Liberia currently because they work themselves out of a job. In 2002, Liberia was gripped by this horrible civil war. I think 250,000 people died. A peacekeeping mission lasted there for a little over 10 years. And, are able to handle their own security and have had multi-party elections and a peaceful handover of power. So it's those kinds of examples, I think, that people sometimes underappreciate.
Exactly. Well, thanks for laying that out. I feel like part of my role in doing this work is to be a cheerleader and
Mm-hmm.
bring some attention to the positivity and more positive in the future.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, it's
yeah,
not all positive. There
of
are
course.
certainly a lot of problems, but it's the problems that are often emphasized as opposed to like the day-to-day work of what the second UN Secretary General said, not sort of bringing the world to heaven, but saving it from hell. That's the basic function, I think.
Well, so say we wanted to make this system stronger and more capable to deal with these big problems that we're facing. Pretend you could just wave your magic wand and just assume there's the political will to do so. What changes would you want to see? How would you want to see it strengthened or improved?
I think one fundamental issue about the UN that people don't appreciate is that how terribly underfunded it is. Um, so the United States is the single largest contributor to the UN. It contributes about 27% of the cost of UN peacekeeping and about 24-ish% of the cost of uh, operating like the regular UN budget, keeping the lights on, paying the bills, paying the translator, paying salaries of the staff at the UN. And the budget of the UN is based on member payment, dues payments from 192 members, with wealthier countries paying a bit more. The US is the largest funder. Then there's a second set of funding streams that, like the UN, when I was talking about the UN, that does. These rely on voluntary contributions. They're essentially funded by donations. The World Food Program, UNICEF, and the UN Refugee Agency. These agencies do incredibly important work around the world, but every year they have to go hat in hand to donors, mostly governments, to fund their work. And inevitably, the needs outpace the demands. So you have situations where, for example, the World Food Program just said yesterday that they're going to run out of, or no, pardon, not yesterday, earlier, last month, that they are going to run out of money for their Afghanistan operations. They're going to have to cut food rations. And so, like, if I could like wave my magic wand, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but I would change the funding structure of some of the UN agencies so that they're funded out of like regular payments as opposed to having to ask for donations all the time. And I would also sharply increase the amount of money that governments around the world pay into these bodies to enable them to more robustly do their work.
I don't have the figures in front of me at the moment, but my memory tells me that the annual budget for the UN system is somewhere around 55 million. Kind
No,
of rings a bell.
no, it's more than that. Like,
Okay.
it depends like how you count the UN system. If you're
Yeah.
talking about like the UN regular budget, so just operating staff, in New York headquarters, in Vienna, and in many missions around the world, that I think comes to, can't quote me on this, so we'll have to fact check this,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
about $6-ish billion a year. And then UN peacekeeping is larger than that. And I can't quote that number off the top of my head, but I think it's about like triple that or double that, triple that, I think. And we'll have to, these are easily accessible numbers.
Yeah.
So
I'll
you're in
find it and
like,
I'll plug it in the show notes here.
but like the point is, I did these calculations once, that the U.S. Department of Defense is about $700 billion a year,
Mm-hmm.
and this is a fraction of that.
Yeah.
Here's a good point of comparison as well. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, is based in Vienna. Its main job, or one of its key jobs, is to monitor compliance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to make sure that countries around the world aren't like building nuclear weapons, including Iran. Um, the budget of the nuclear inspectors for the IAEA is less than the police budget of the city of Vienna, where the IAEA is located. So it's just like kind of it's sort of factoids like that, which I think underscore how we give the UN this kind of outsized role in world affairs, yet it is not often resourced accordingly.
Well, and I find it striking to compare those kinds of figures with the amount the world spends on military each year. So,
Mhm.
like the United States, over 700 billion in military, and in the world, all the countries spend, I think it's 2 trillion per year, which is so many times over what the UN budget is. You know, you could double or quadruple or times 10 the UN budget and not even come close to what the world spends on military. So it just sort of shows me that the world maybe cares more about fighting than about solving problems. It just
Mhm.
seems really kind of whack to me.
Wait,
But why
I
don't?
found the figures. I found the figures.
Oh, good.
It's about 3 billion a year for the regular budget, and about 6.5 billion for a peacekeeping budget.
Yeah, yeah.
And they do their the reason I was giving higher numbers is that they approve their budget on the biennium every 2 years. So I
Mm,
was combining the two.
yeah. So why do you think there is such a huge funding shortfall? Why don't countries see it as useful to kick in more funding and make more happen?
Um, I think many countries do, to their credit. There are a lot of countries in the world that contribute, particularly to those voluntary contributions to like the World Food Program, the UN Refugee Agency, UNICEF, those kind of humanitarian organizations above their weight. The Scandinavian countries in particular, Norway in particular, has always been a very robust funder of humanitarian initiatives and causes. Um, like you look here in the United States, at least the country whose politics I'm most familiar with, and the incentives don't necessarily align with, contributing more to foreign entities, even though it makes sense in the long run. There's not often the short term gain. There's in this sort of bifurcated partisan politics we have here in the United States, the general Republican approach to the United Nations, and there has been more or less a consensus that was kind of broken by Trump, but still exists to a certain degree among Republican elected officials, that the UN does serve American interests. It is like a useful entity, yet their approach to the UN tends to be one in which they want to withhold funding from the UN in order to extract concessions from it, in terms of how it operates, in terms of what it sees as its priorities. And it uses kind of like the purse strings to try to influence how the UN works in ways that they perceive to be like in their interests. And in some cases, they're able to withhold funding from UN agencies. So, for example, whenever a Republican is in charge of the White House, the United States no longer funds the UN Population Fund, which is a UN entity that supports reproductive health and sexual health around the world because of like abortion politics here in the United States. Even though the UNFPA doesn't have anything to do with abortions, it's still kind of like caught up in that. Whereas when Democrats are in office, they are more likely to want to work with the United Nations and provided it with the funding it needs. Though there's rarely this like clamoring to sharply increase the UN funding. I mean, we have like one good example before us. We're speaking in October, and a month from now, we have a huge climate change conference organized under UN auspices, COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland. This is like a huge inflection point for climate change. It was supposed to happen last year as a 5-year checkup on the 2015 Paris Accords, but it was delayed a year because of COVID. So this is supposed to be the time in which countries that have joined the Paris Accords increase their ambitions on climate change, and to increase what they're going to individually bring to the table to collectively do something more meaningful on climate change. And one key sticking point in these negotiations is this figure of $100 billion towards climate mitigation and adaptation that the wealthier countries in the world, those of us who are more responsible for the junk in the atmosphere, will contribute to poorer countries in the world who suffer disproportionately because of climate change and have little and are not responsible for it because they're not the ones who have been polluting for hundreds of years. So there is this idea. It was actually agreed to in 2009 at the Copenhagen climate summit that these countries would bring $100 billion a year to the table to support these poor countries. That money just like hasn't been mobilized. Biden, to his credit, has increased what the U.S. is pledging to it, but it's nowhere near commensurate the amount that's required to meet this kind of fundamental linchpin of international climate negotiations. So that's just like one example, and there's like climate activists who are clamoring for it, but other constituencies of U.S. politics are not clamoring for this, $100 billion in climate finance. It doesn't have to all come from the United States, but a lot of it should, given that we are the top contributor to like carbon in the atmosphere.
Yeah. And it strikes me as strange that during COVID-19 pandemic, wealthier countries came up with so many trillions of dollars for economic stimulus. Like they obviously can find money when they want to find money, but yet $100 billion to save humanity from destruction, from climate change, somehow they can't come up with it. It's just like, it's really strange to me.
It's, like I say, it's a matter of political will. I mean, there is $100 billion a year out there, spread amongst all the countries of the world.
We have the money.
Yeah, it's just a matter of political will.
Yeah. Well, and what I've been noticing too is with this UN system, it's not only just low funding that's a problem, but it seems to be so erratic. Like if a country doesn't pay their bills and then the UN is scrambling, like, hey, how do we pay for something this year? Like it's hard to budget when countries are so intermittent in their paying their bills. And then, like you say, the UN's going around after some emergency, like, hey, please, can you kick in money to help these poor people we're trying to help? It's just not a sound way to run an organization with all that inconsistency.
Yeah, the UN actually last year ran into a liquidity crisis where so many countries were late on their due payments that the Secretary General warned that they're going to have to start like shutting down some operations.
That's not good.
No,
Let's
and
try
then
to fix
you
that.
have like and the way in which the international community has decided to respond to natural and man-made crises, like an earthquake in Haiti or like the dissolution of Syria and the humanitarian crisis that follows, is generally by having like a giant fundraising summit. You have the UN agencies are coordinated by this entity at the UN called the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It goes by the acronym OCHA. They assess what, say, the World Food Program needs to do food for this crisis, what UNICEF needs to do. They do water and sanitation. They, if there's a humanitarian emergency, UNICEF is, in charge of the water in the toilets, in addition to other aspects of child health. Basically, and there are also private organizations like Save the Children or the International Rescue Committee that are involved in these efforts. And so they get a kind of like a grand total. This is like what our needs are to provide basic humanitarian relief to X number of people for X period of time this is what we need. Say it's like $1 billion. They'll put out a call for pledges, and they'll typically get about 30% of what they ask for, depending on the crisis. But usually, it's tough initially, at least, to get more than 30%, and then they'll get more over time. But it's always like a hard job fundraising, and then you end up competing with crises. Like if you're a government with resources, say you have like $10 million to donate for food aid. Do you give it to the famine in Yemen, or do you give it to the famine in Ethiopia? I mean, it's a challenge uh, for governments to sort of deal with, and it's just like it's at once I think a good thing that we have entities and organizations that are out there trying to coordinate a humanitarian response. They're like the ambulance service that comes after a crisis. Yet at the same time, it certainly can be more efficient.
And it seems a healthy setup would be to just fund it in advance because we know there's always going to be more calamities in the world. That's just how
Yeah,
the world works. Just put the money in there, have it ready so you have the staff and supplies ready to go and can
yeah,
just go there right away instead of after the fact being
yeah.
slow and trying to scrounge up money. So,
They did, I like in 2005 ish, create a kind of um, what they call the Central Emergency Response Fund, which is, a few $1 million here and there that the UN agencies can release immediately for like a quick injection of funds to support quick emergency relief for both quick onset emergencies, but also more neglected ones that don't have the kind of political cachet to whip to get like a lot of donations. Like if a crisis is happening in a country that is far from a priority from the major donors, it's much harder to raise money for that humanitarian emergency.
all right, we have some work to do, some
Mhm.
things to fix. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the Security Council.
Mhm.
The Security Council has many functions within the UN, but largely around war and peace and those kinds of issues, but also in just how the UN is structured and how it functions. And it troubles me that 5 countries in the world have veto power, and any one of them can stop almost anything the UN wants to do. It seems to just shut down a lot of potential action. What do you think about this? I mean, what it seems to me there's a big need to change this. Do people talk about this?
So, Security Council reform is like an ever present issue at the United Nations. As long as I've been covering it, there's been clamoring to figure out how to maybe reform the veto or add new countries as permanent members to make it reflect the realities of 2021 as opposed to the realities of like 1945. Um,
Just for listeners, I want to
yeah.
remind them that the big 5 are the US, China, Russia, England, and France,
Mhm.
which came out on top after World War II, but don't really reflect the power structure of today's world.
Yes.
Yeah.
Although I also don't want to overstate Security Council paralysis because of the veto. There is a lot of day-to-day work of the Security Council that gets done very unremarkably and without anyone casting a veto. And in fact, vetoes are rare because the Security Council seeks to achieve consensus. Most of the day-to-day work of the Security Council involves renewing and reviewing the mandate of UN peacekeeping missions around the world. Like, so for example, you have a peacekeeping mission in the Central African Republic. It was, and every year, once a year, its mandate comes up for renewal. And its mandate includes how many troops should be dispatched, what should the troops' jobs be, um, how should we approach this Security Council mission? Should there be benchmarks for success? Things like that. And these, because there are many Security Council, pardon me, many peacekeeping missions, these mandate renewals come up fairly often, and they are usually very well debated and discussed, and there's almost always consensus and agreement at the Security Council to renew the mandate and to fix the mandate to current priorities. And it usually happens. I mean, there's always like some debate between countries about what should be emphasized, but usually the mandate gets renewed, and this happens a lot. This is like the day-to-day work of the Security Council, and it's overlooked because it is like the everyday work of the council, and there's almost never a veto cast to block this kind of work. So there is still a great deal of cooperation that happens. It just doesn't get the attention that the discord does. And the discord often results in paralysis by the council, which restricts the Security Council's ability to do anything about ongoing crises. And that's, I think, the key challenge. And I think a reflection of geopolitics today. I mean, you've seen a growing split between the United States, United Kingdom, and France on the one hand, and China and Russia on the other. And those splits have become even more aggravated over time. You saw it in Syria, where Russia steadfastly refused to allow any meaningful resolution to pass a Security Council that might have nudged the de-escalation of the Syria crisis. You see it manifest itself, on the other hand, on the Arab-Israeli conflict, where the U.S. is often the one preventing Security Council unanimity on resolutions pertaining to the Arab-Israeli conflict. So yes, it's definitely like a problem. And it is an ongoing problem, and it's a problem that's getting worse as geopolitical tensions heighten, specifically between the US and Russia and China. But I also don't want to overstate the problem. Like, the Security Council still works and does a lot of important work. It just doesn't, as I said, get the attention of the discord.
Do you think there's times when issues are just simply not brought up for consideration because countries assume that one of the countries will veto? Like, oh, we're not even going to bother because I know China won't go for it. Or, nah, the US won't go for that. We won't even talk about it because it's useless.
So in those situations, they diplomats at the UN have devised a way a way to still hold Security Council meetings that aren't actually Security Council meetings, because they know certain countries would object. These, not to get too nerdy, these are called Arya Formula meetings because they're named after a South American diplomat who thought of this. But basically, if you are the United States and you want to shine a spotlight on, and this actually was a meeting during the Obama administration, on violence committed against LGBT people, the U.S. wanted to hold this meeting. Russia, would not have anything to do with it, and they wouldn't even attend, or they wouldn't even agree to this being on the council. So they held like a parallel meeting of the Security Council members, except Russia, to kind of highlight this. And stuff like that happens often. But you'll also get you'll have diplomats kind of feel each other out. So, for example, a recent challenge was Myanmar. The coup in Myanmar was something that was of concern to the entire international community. China, being so close to Myanmar, had a certain way to approach this that differed from much of the rest of the Security Council. And so it's in those negotiations that you try to find whatever common ground you have. And there are different levels of action the Security Council can take. There's a resolution, which is like the most basic kind of form of statement that this is what we in the Security Council agree needs to happen. And a resolution needs to have 9 affirmative votes and 0 vetoes from any of the 5 members in order to pass. And resolutions have the power, if they so invoke it, of becoming binding international law. They could they could authorize a military intervention or peacekeeping missions under binding international law, Chapter 7 authority they have. That's like one level of action. Then there's other levels of action that are important as well. These are called a Security Council statement or a presidential statement or a press statement, basically statements. And the significance of a statement is that it reflects the consensus of the Security Council. All 15 members need to agree to it. And so oftentimes you'll have a situation where there's an ongoing emergency somewhere, or like one country is threatening to fight another, and the Security Council will issue a statement which itself expresses, total global concern over this crisis that's unfolding. And whereas it doesn't have the force of law, it is a reflection of consensus and sort of where the world stands on it. So oftentimes leaders do pay a lot of attention to that.
Hmm.
And I should say those like statements of consensus still happen all the time.
Yeah. Do you think they make a difference? These sort of statements or resolutions, or the body saying we believe this, does it get anybody to change their behavior?
Yeah, I think it oftentimes gets governments to perhaps restrain themselves in ways that they might not otherwise, knowing that, okay, even Russia and China agreed to the statement.
Mm.
Maybe they really don't want us to take that next step, uh, and put them in a position where they might have to cast a veto on our behalf, or maybe they won't cast a veto on our behalf. So
Yeah.
I think it does help serve as a to restrain actions in that way. But Chapter 7 resolutions certainly have like an impact on the world, compelling countries to do certain things. I mean, so for example, a Chapter 7 resolution off the top of my head was a 2011 resolution authorizing NATO intervention in Libya. Like a lot of countries, because that resolution passed, joined the coalition that bombed Libya and got rid of Gaddafi. Whether or not that was like a good or bad thing, you can debate, but that enabled that intervention to happen. Or another Chapter 7 resolution gave the International Criminal Court jurisdiction over the genocide in Darfur and over Sudan. And now there's a situation where you have the former, now deposed dictator of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, like may now be sent to The Hague to face trial. So these do have like real world impacts. Or sanctions is probably the biggest one. North Korea sanctions.
Right.
It was in Iran sanctions. It was Chapter 7 sanctions on certain industries in Iran that brought Iran to the table for nuclear talks. And similarly, the world has a number of the Security Council has a number of sanctions imposed on North Korea individuals, and as well as other sanctions against nefarious actors around the world.
So I know this perception I have about the UN system, which I know will vary by issue area, but there's times when I wish it had more teeth in order to like make things happen, and enforce things rather than just saying, hey, please, can you do this? Or, so like in the area of the climate that we talked about earlier, there's this voluntary process where countries just willingly offer how much they're willing to cut their emissions. And I don't know, we'll see. Maybe they'll do it, maybe they won't. And a lot of them won't. And there's no real enforcement process. Or like, when countries are tearing down their rainforest, which has global implications. There doesn't seem to be a process for saying, hey, you can't do that. You have to stop. Or, the world trade that happens is sort of devouring nature around the world due to overconsumption. But we don't have any system to say, hey, we got to stop this. Don't do that. Do you see opportunities to beef up this kind of thing where the international body can actually enforce better behavior that protects us all?
So enforcement generally comes through treaties. And you're talking about like the climate, the Paris Climate Agreement is not a treaty. It's like a political agreement. The climate agreement that preceded it, the Kyoto Protocol, was a treaty. But the United States, for one, didn't join the treaty. There are other environmental treaties that have been wildly successful, like the Montreal Protocol to close the hole in the ozone layer. That's probably the most successful environmental treaty of all time. And it worked because in treaties, there tend to be enforcement mechanisms where countries are brought to task should they violate the obligations that they signed up for under the treaty. Um, the problem is treaties are harder and harder to pass, at least here in the United States, especially kind of more controversial ones. There's some like uncontroversial treaties that are fine, but treaties having to do with the environment or military force have an exceptionally difficult hurdle here in the United States. You know, the base of the United Nations, the host country, where you need like over 2/3 of the United States Senate to ratify a treaty, and you know we can't get 50 senators to pass a reconciliation bill. So you see it; these things get very, very difficult. So
And many
treaties,
other countries have the same kind of trouble getting on board with a treaty.
yeah,
They
yeah,
have their
but
own
you know,
politics too.
yeah. So that's I think you know part of the issue. The other is just like how the UN is structured. I mean, the Secretary General is maybe more a secretary than a general. He has no army. He can't. If there is a peacekeeping mission that should be deployed somewhere, the UN doesn't have a standing peacekeeping force to deploy to stop like an oncoming army from ravaging a group of civilians. They need to call on UN member states to summon their troops. There's not like you can't like wave a magic wand and deploy and deploy troops somewhere. Yeah, I mean it's a problem. It's just, I think, a reflection of international politics as it exists today more than anything else, that governments are less willing to give up a degree of sovereignty to this supranational organization, give up some of their sovereignty in order to achieve that common good, is that just like been a very difficult ask. And it's even more difficult now in sort of the current international political climate.
Something I wish would happen in these conversations is that countries would not see it as a restriction of their own sovereignty, but would see these stronger tools as a way to get all their neighbors on board with the good thing. So that if you want to help the environment, be good to the climate, just generally be good, you don't have to take the risk of going out there alone, because a better international system will make everybody else do it too and just get everybody on board at the same time. I kind of wish the shift would occur in people's thinking instead of being afraid of international systems.
Yeah, I mean, that's like a general multilateralist way of looking at the world. And let's be honest, there's like a huge constituency here in the United States for what you articulated. And I think it's probably an ideal that's shared by Biden himself. I mean, it is. He is someone who, over the course of his career, has demonstrated an affinity for multilateralism and a belief that working cooperatively with other countries around the world is a better way to solve global problems. But like I said, the UN does not have jurisdiction over everything, and it is not like a institution of global governance that is a world government. It is a platform for cooperation on things. And so when governments want to get together and cooperate on things, they can accomplish huge things. Like I said, closing the hole in the ozone layer. That was an environmental treaty, negotiated through the UN, and governments around the world, saw this as a common threat to humanity, and they got it done. It's just like a matter, I think, more or less of political will.
Do you think that political will varies? Well, I know it varies country by country, but what are some of the countries that would be influential and helpful on making the UN more capable versus what are some other countries that might stand in the way?
And to some degree, I think it varies issue by issue. But in general, like the historic trend has been that European countries see greater value in establishing firm rules of the international road, and in wanting to build a robust international legal architecture to facilitate global cooperation. That's something I think ingrained in the post war European psyche.
that they've practiced by forming the European Union. They've been
Exactly.
doing that for decades. So,
Yeah, exactly. And but you're now sort of forced into this new kind of superpower rivalry between the United States and China, which upends that to a certain degree. One thing that has been interesting to see over the last several years has been the extent and the degree to which China, as the rising power, has sought not to replace the international system that was built by the United States mostly at the end of World War II, but to participate in it. And so, to a certain degree, it has been heartening to see that China is working to a degree within the UN and is working kind of cooperatively within the UN as opposed to trying to like destroy it from the outside, as opposed to viewing it as this kind of Western liberal democratic institution. Rather, it's sort of latching onto it to a certain degree, which I think is important and also a demonstration that the United Nations can be useful in managing and working with major global power shifts in which you have the US declining, China rising. This is usually, according to international relations theory, a time in which a world war would break out. So it'll be like it's somewhat heartening to see China working cooperatively within the UN on many issues, though they could invade Taiwan tomorrow, and that could be off the table. But so far, they have not taken this like radical approach to the established international order. They've done their own they've done their own things in their region, establishing like a kind of rival to the World Bank, the Asia Infrastructure Development Bank, but it hasn't. They're not seeking to overturn the rules of the road that were established, after World War II.
so I know that I'm not alone, and you're not alone in wanting to see a stronger United Nations system to serve our needs. And I know that there's a whole collection of organizations and advocates and policymakers that are pushing for this and putting good ideas out there and talking about it. But for whatever reason, we haven't gotten the sort of grassroots citizen uprising or push or whatever to get governments on board with improvements. I mean, do you see, I don't know, what needs to happen, I guess, for us to get countries on board with a more international approach?
Um, I don't have a background in organizing. I couldn't tell you what I
It's
think
fine.
citizens need to do to rise up. I mean, there are important grassroots organizations out there, there's like the United Nations associations around the world, um, that try to get individuals connected with the United Nations and to have them support the idea of international cooperation through the UN, and also around important international issues like anti-poverty and other issues around like the sustainable development goals. So I mean, there is that. And I know the United Nations also has tried to take a big steps in recent years in order to kind of reach people directly. They've done over a couple of times over the last few years these like huge survey endeavors in which they seek to, in as many communities around the world, as many languages as possible, conduct these surveys in order to get feedback directly from individuals about what their priorities are in their sort of local context. And presumably the leadership of the UN would then, take those into account when designing programs and initiatives.
In this whole space of UN improvements, I see a need for some really big changes that some might see as politically infeasible. Like, oh yeah, you're not going to get people to sign on to that. That's too crazy. But then maybe they're not talked about enough because people don't see them as politically feasible. Like, do you think there's sort of a restraint that people have, like not wanting to be too out there in their suggestions and stay with more, I don't know, small baby steps that maybe aren't enough?
Uh, I don't
Or
know.
are there others being as bold as we need in their suggestions?
I mean, if you look at like the Secretary General, when COVID broke out, he called for a global ceasefire. I mean,
That's
that's
pretty
pretty
big.
bold. That's pretty
Yeah.
bold. And
Yeah.
yeah, the Security Council didn't take him up on it. So there
Yeah.
are
True.
people out there, important people out there who are, I think, trying to think big and act big,
Mm.
but they are typically constrained by politics.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I know that you have limited time, and I can let you go when you're ready. But is there any sort of last thoughts on what we've been talking about today that are, maybe we didn't hit that you want to raise?
I would just emphasize that like the Sustainable Development Goals, which were created in 2015 and are due in 2030, are an important reflection, I think, of a United Nations that is opening itself up to outside suggestion. Uh, the Sustainable Development Goals replace the Millennium Development Goals, which were developed kind of behind closed doors and imposed upon the world, whereas the Sustainable Development Goals were the product of a lot of input from civil society, from individuals, from people in the developing world, people are around the world. And as a result, I think they are on much stronger political footing. And the Sustainable Development Goals, even if you have countries who act in contravention to a lot of what the United Nations uh, would idealistically stand for. I think the Sustainable Development Goals have still nonetheless served as a rallying cry and as a benchmark against which governments, even local governments, measure progress themselves. And so the advent of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 and their introduction in the world has, I think, been an important catalyst for social and economic development around the world, even if it's not routinely recognized as such.
I agree. They're incredibly important. Do you feel like we're on track to meet them?
No, COVID knocked us off track. Some we may be on track for. I haven't. I usually do like an episode on this for my podcast once or twice a year about whether or not what we're on track for, what we're not on track for. But the COVID did real bad damage to the Sustainable Development Goals, knocking us off course on a lot of them. So we'll have to see the extent to which we're able to bounce back. But we'll see.
Yeah. Well, and I guess the system includes, data
Yeah,
collection and progress and all that, so people can
yeah,
hopefully see soon, like, hey, we got to get back on. So,
yeah.
yeah. Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been really useful for me, and I assume for the listeners too, to learn about this stuff. And I'm just grateful for you spending some time with me. Thank you
All
so
right.
much.
Thanks so
Yeah.
much.
And listeners, I will encourage you to listen to Mark's podcast, check out his news service, his blog. I will put links to all these in the show notes. And thank you for joining us. I'm grateful for you spending some time with me. All right, take care. Bye bye. Thanks for listening, but you're not done yet. We can't change the world if we keep the joy of saving the human race to ourselves. Help me spread the word and help this movement grow. Please subscribe to the show, both the podcast and the YouTube channel. Leave ratings or reviews, which encourages others to listen. Share this show with others on your social media. Even better, just tell a friend about it and have a good conversation about the state of the world. These things really make a difference. I hope you can help the show grow and reach a larger audience. I'm grateful for your help. Thank you. And please stay in touch with me. I love to get feedback, suggestions, and questions. Go to the website at joyofsavingthehumanrace.com. At the website, you'll learn more about the show, and you can sign up to get occasional email updates. Thanks to Moby for the show's theme music, and thanks to you for being here. All right, we're done for today. Be well. I'll talk to you soon.